Robert Louis Balfour Stevenson was born in this house in Edinburgh on November 13th, 1850. It's on the very edge of what is called the New Town, the fine squares and terraces begun towards the end of the 18th century, to the north of the city. Edinburgh is a delightful city to grow up in if you are a sensitive soul, as Stevenson was. It's situated on the south bank of the estuary of the River Forth and is open to lots of chilly winds. Its vast and romantic castle, stuck on the rock, which forms a sort of backbone to the city, is irresistible. Everywhere, even after the depredations of 2 centuries, there are fine buildings to add a wonderful air of grace and civilization. To the south there are dramatic hills. Who would not respond to all this? Of course, since the taste and elegance of the free thinkers of the 18th century, Scotland has been plagued by an overdose of Presbyterian Christianity in the 19th century and of socialism in the 20th. Neither of these beliefs, however well-meaning, are noted for bringing taste and culture and the finer things of civilization in their wake. But enough remains of the glories of the new town today for us to believe in Stevenson's passionate regard for his city and the nation of the Scots. The family moved from here to a larger house across the road from number 8 Howard Place, but it was damp and considered bad for the delicate little Louis. They moved to 17 Heriot Row in 1856 when he was 6 years old, and here he lived out his childhood and adolescence. Louis, it was pronounced with an S by his family, was the only son of Thomas and Margaret Stevenson. Thomas was a successful lighthouse engineer, as his father and grandfather had been before him. He invented the revolving light, which, with characteristic generosity, he didn't patent. Lewis later wrote a description of his father's contradictory character. He was a supporter of the doctrines of the Protestant Church of Scotland, though with his own unusual interpretations of these doctrines. He was a Tory in politics, was hot-headed, and very chivalrous towards women. He even believed that women should have divorce for the asking, and men should not. He was a blend of sternness and softness, melancholy and genial good humour. He was passionately prejudiced about many things, which characteristic made life for his son often difficult. His mother was Margaret Balfour, daughter of a clergyman, minister of the church of the nearby village of Collenton. She married Thomas when she was 19 in 1848. She was tolerant, good-natured, and, while genuinely pious, was also of a happy disposition. She was devoted to Lewis and forever proud of his talents and success. The third person to affect Lewis' early life was Alison Cunningham, or Cummy, as she was affectionately called. She was his nurse from when he was 18 months old. He was a delicate child and needed constant and particular care. He was grateful to her for that. As with all cases where parents, for some strange reason, hand their most treasured possessions, their children, over to the care of others for the greater part of their early life, Lewis had to suffer her uneducated but strong character, as well as her strict beliefs in a narrow Scottish Protestantism. Added to this were a wide range of superstitions. You could argue that it broadened his education. She also loved him devotedly, and her dramatic renderings of the Bible stories stuck in his mind forever. The immediate surroundings of the house in Heriot Row, where he spent his childhood, made a huge impression on him. The fine stone buildings of Edinburgh have a rightness and a sense of quality and scale that few domestic developments have ever matched. There are gardens for children to play in. Here and there are shops, in one of which Lewis bought his penny-plain, twopence-coloured toy theatre figures. Also a part of his childhood was Colinton, the home of his minister grandfather. At Colinton he played with his cousins, and it was the garden at Colinton that formed the background to his poems, collected as A Child's Garden of Verses. For a few years he went to the Edinburgh Academy, a few hundred yards to the north of Heriot Row. Its classical facades and grand layout were a fitting part of the Athens of the North, as Edinburgh was known. School, however, did not make a great impression on him. In keeping with his father's wishes, in 1867 he entered Edinburgh University to study engineering, with a view to following his father's footsteps as a lighthouse engineer. He certainly enjoyed university life, making good and lasting friends, and joining the speculative society, where those of philosophical bent argued the toss. He did a tour of Scottish lighthouses, which he greatly enjoyed, as it opened up the beauties of Scottish scenery to him. About this time, the family started holidaying at Swanston Cottage, outside Edinburgh, which was to become a favourite spot for him. It's easy to see why. It's a comfortable and sizable property, with a wonderful garden, and lying close to the bare Pentland Hills. Lewis was immensely sensitive to places and his surroundings, as his writing was to show, and in such a place as this, his sensitivity was nurtured. Lewis began to write imaginative stories at an early age, and by the time he was at university was determined to become a writer, despite his father's wishes. He acted in university drama productions, wrote essays in university journals, wore bohemian clothes, took up smoking, thumbed his nose at Christian morality, and determinedly went so far as to seek out the low life of prostitutes and drunks, easily enough found in Edinburgh after dark. About this time came into his life again his childhood friend and cousin, Bob Stevenson, just down from Cambridge, a brilliant talker with an original mind, and just the sort of companion for Lewis. Bob eventually became a professor of art history at Liverpool University, but he substantially helped Lewis to develop his own views on life. Inevitably, these views conflicted with those of his father. By chance, Thomas Stevenson found a written statement of the views of a discussion group started by Bob and Lewis. "Disregard anything our parents taught us," it began. Thomas questioned Lewis, and amongst other things, Lewis declared he no longer believed in God. All this was more than his father could take. Lewis gave up engineering at the university and began to study law. After all, Sir Walter Scott, whose work Lewis greatly admired, had been a lawyer, but the feud with his father seemed irreparable. We know a lot about it through an interesting friendship begun at this time. Visiting a cousin in Suffolk in 1873, Lewis met Mrs. Frances Sitwell, separated from her philandering husband and working as a secretary to support her only child, a very advanced step to take for the time. She was beautiful and brilliant, but 10 years older than Lewis, and all set to marry the art critic Sidney Colvin when she was free to do so. According to the law of the day, of course, this was only when her husband died, unless he decided to divorce her. Frances Sitwell was a sensitive and unusual woman, and their correspondence over several years is one of Stevenson's most remarkable. He obviously loved her, but she equally obviously kept him at a safe distance. Thankfully, Colvin understood and accepted their strange relationship, and eventually was rewarded by marrying her after her husband fortunately died. Lewis was always delicate, and the strain of his relationship with his parents added to his woes when, on a visit to London, he suffered a severe throat infection and had a complete physical collapse. The cure was a rest in a mild climate, alone. He went to Menton on the Riviera and wrote feverishly to Frances Sitwell. The separation from Scotland and his parents worked well for him. His health improved, and he read a great deal. Montaigne, Defoe, Lamb, Wordsworth, and also modern writers like Walt Whitman, whose original and independent views on life meant a great deal to him. He wrote at length to his parents, saying how much he admired the ideals of Christianity, which he felt they so sympathetically represented, but he could not go along with the beliefs. To his surprise, they telegraphed back, saying they were quite satisfied with his letter. In fact, they were intensely worried about his health, and were therefore quite ready to humour him, no matter what views he held. When he returned to Scotland, they accepted that he be a writer, and he was granted an allowance of £84 a year. He wrote essays and studied law. It was 1874, and his relations with his parents were at least calm. In mid-July 1875, he was admitted to the Scottish Bar, and a plate was put up on 17 Heriot Row saying R. L. Stevenson, Advocate. However, a few days later he left for London and France. Not settling down might be said to be Lewis' creed for the creative artist, and he was to roam about for most of the rest of his life. Partly this was a need for the excitement of travel and seeing new places and people. Partly it was a reaction against the bourgeois respectability of his own Presbyterian Scottish background. It was also part of his search for a climate which suited his delicate health. Just before he left Edinburgh, he met there W. E. Henley, a poet, playwright and critic at the time of some renown, though hardly known today. Henley was to become a significant friend to Stevenson. For the moment he was a patient in an Edinburgh hospital, and the two got on famously. Barbazon is a small village near Fontainebleau in France, where, at the end of the 19th century, a number of artists, led there by Jean-François Millet, used to go in the summer. There too went Bob to paint, and after him went Lewis, where he greatly enjoyed the artistic life and the people he met there. The inn there was beloved of all painters, and there Louis stayed for several summers, improving his French and continuing to write a steady stream of articles and essays, some of which were published in London. All of this barbarism living was paid for by his father because, of course, he still hardly earned anything. Not far from Barbizon, at Grès, Bob met an American woman artist and her family. Fanny Osborne and her pretty 17-year-old daughter Isabel and young son were living apart from her husband, who, although amiable, was extremely unreliable. Louis met them too, and while Isabel might have been the expected entanglement, in fact Louis fell in love with the mother, Fanny, aged 37 and 10 years older than Louis. It didn't happen at once, and it was about 2 years before Louis contemplated marriage. Quite apart from differences of age and background and her married state, he saw marriage as a huge step for an artist to take. He had a real sense of commitment, of course, and saw marriage as an all-or-nothing affair. Certainly Mrs. Osborne must have found this a lot different from Sam Osborne, who at one time simply disappeared, presumed dead, and at other times philandered in every direction. In 1878, Lewis had a travel book called An Inland Voyage published, his first substantial work. In the same year, he made a walking tour in the Cevennes, the arid mountains in the south of France. Out of this came Travels with a Donkey. Not just travel talk, but pieces about life and love, which he liked. He made a stir in Scotland in an essay about Robert Burns, Scotland's poet and national hero. The poems he admired, but the man's way of living he did not. Such criticism was not well received in Scotland, but he did not meet the response in person, for Fanny, who had returned to California, cabled she was ill. He set out at once to see what he could do, writing of his fascinating journey across the Atlantic and the United States. His account appeared in a book called The Amateur Immigrant, though not after some excisions, at the request of his father and friends, who found it too realistic. By the Southern Pacific Railroad, he got to Salinas, south of San Francisco, and from there a short journey took him to Monterey and Fanny on the coast of the Pacific. It was 1879, and he stayed for a while in this house, ill and uncertain about whether Fanny would get a divorce. He liked Monterey, but Fanny moved to San Francisco to sort things out with her husband. In San Francisco he was ill again and again. He assumed he had tuberculosis, though later medical opinion has concluded he did not, but suffered another disease of the lungs. However it was, he suffered terrible bouts of pneumonia and bronchitis and had hemorrhages, which brought him often near death. He ran out of money and asked his old college friend Baxter for help. It came in the form of an allowance of £250 a year from his father. Fanny got her divorce, and they were married in San Francisco by a Scots minister. Fanny wrote charmingly to his parents, who wanted to meet her, so off they went to Scotland. In spite of Lewis' anxieties, Fanny hit it off well in Heriot Row, especially with old Thomas Stevenson, who liked her fun and her practicality and her obvious devotion to his son. But the Scottish climate did not suit Lewis, and they were advised to go to Davos in the Swiss Alps. Of Lewis' friends, Colvin alone got on well with Fanny and thought she was good for him. Others were less well pleased, but the sense of completion his marriage brought turned him at last in the direction of fiction, and he wrote one of his best short stories, Thrawn Janet. This was followed by Treasure Island, which grew out of a map drawn to amuse Lloyd Osborne, 12 years old and part of the family. It was published in a boys' magazine in serial form in 1881 and 82. Maybe even Lewis didn't realize that he had given rise to a new style of adventure story, where the action flies ahead, but the moral ambiguities of life are equally present. Nothing about Treasure Island is quite straightforward. Davos they didn't like. Scotland didn't agree with Lewis, so again they moved. This time to the south of France, spending about a year at Hyères on the Côte d'Azur. There, with a magnificent view, he produced his delightful A Child's Garden of Verses. And with Treasure Island out in book form, he made over £300 in 1883 from his writing. With Fanny to help keep him alive and away from his difficult friends, they settled next in Bournemouth, on England's south coast, in a house they called Skerry Vore, bought for Fanny by old Thomas Stevenson. There, John Singer Sargent came to paint them in this unusual picture. Lewis strokes his moustache, and Fanny lurks in the background. This was the beginning of fame. To Bournemouth came Henry James, who became a close friend and an ardent admirer of Stevenson's work. James became a regular and extremely popular visitor. James and Stevenson agreed largely on what fiction was about, but indulged in fascinating correspondence on the subject, which they both enjoyed. At Bournemouth, Stevenson wrote Kidnapped and The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This book sold 40,000 copies in the first 6 months. In America, it was pirated by the 100,000. His father died in May 1887, and with his mother now in tow, they set off for the States, where Colorado was said to be good for his health. With a case of champagne from Henry James to send them on their way, in New York they were met by crowds of reporters. The publishers, Scribner's, offered him £700 a year for a steady stream of articles, and he began writing The Master of Ballantrae. Abroad he certainly was, but there is no doubting that his heart lay in Scotland. In the States his health improved, so he put into effect a plan to visit the Southern Pacific, a plan he had long harboured. It was to be a significant step. On their chartered schooner Casco, they left San Francisco for the South Sea Islands. Lewis was never to return. The sea seemed to agree with Lewis, and he was never better than when he was on board ship. The idea of the writer of Treasure Island going off to sea to the islands of the Pacific was already turning Stevenson into a legend in his own time. His life there, he stayed there from 1888 until his death in 1894, did everything to magnify the legend until it almost crowded out his talents as a writer. After some wandering from island to island, Lewis bought some land on the island of Apia in Samoa and began constructing a house. Vailima, as it was called, up in the hills above the little capital city of Apia, seemed to suit his health admirably. The position he came to occupy amongst the local people he also came to enjoy, and there is little doubt that he was happy on Apia. He became involved in the politics of the island, and the help he gave to the islanders was returned in the form of a road they built up to his house, called the Road of the Loving Heart. Lewis' letters from Vailima are among the best he wrote. His writings on the islands show his wonderful sensitivity to place and people, and the novel he was writing at his death, Weir of Hermiston, is Stevenson writing at his best and his most original. The sudden death of so romantic a figure as Stevenson caused quite a sensation and added to his legendary stature. His reputation as a writer suffered a real blow when his one-time friend Henley, undoubtedly jealous of Stevenson's success, wrote a poisonous review of Lewis' work, suggesting it was weak and without substance. Time has been on Stevenson's side, and there are few writers whose works are better known worldwide. Few writers have dealt with the ambiguities of human nature so powerfully. Even the ever-popular Treasure Island is so because we're never sure to the end whose side to come down on. Stevenson was surely the global man in every sense, yet until the end of his life he returned again and again to his roots, in his case his beloved Scotland, for his inspiration. And it is this wonderful ability to be utterly human and rooted in reality, yet to embrace universally recognized values with equal avidity, that made him in his day, and makes him still in ours, appreciated by young and old of every clime. More than most writers, Robert Louis Stevenson is a man we feel we would really like to have known. We feel we would have been glad to be in his company. We feel we would have been charmed by him, as his Samoan islanders were, and as we are by his books.